Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. This series is presented jointly by International Research Project Heritage and Placemaking and Nepal Conversations. In this sixth episode of the Erasure Series, we are pleased to present our conversation with Dr Mallika Shakya. Mallika Shakya is a Senior Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology at Southasia University. She's interested in interdisciplinary research methods and has been collaborating with poets and fiction writers, filmmakers, and medical professionals, especially in her research on borders within South Asia. Her writings have been published in leading academic journals focusing on economic anthropology and South Asian studies. Welcome to Nepal Conversations, Mallika ji. It's really wonderful to have you in this podcast series. You talk about the Ralpha movement. What exactly was the Ralpha movement and what was its significance during the Panchayat period?
Thank you for giving me this platform, Umaji. It's a pleasure. So the Ralpha movement is quite an intriguing movement from the 60s because it's definitely left in its ideological orientation, and it managed to somehow connect with the larger audience, first outside Kathmandu in the Eastern Hills and other places of Nepal, but later also with the urban citizens of Kathmandu in terms of the public consciousness of the time, which could be equated with a kind of post-colonial sentiments that's kind of brewing in the region and around the world. And what is kind of quite intriguing about the movement is that clearly it has this resistive inclination against the Panchayat, autocratic regime that was in Nepal at that time. But it developed a kind of distinct aesthetics with which these sentiments or political public consciousness could be articulated through performative mediums such as poetry, singing, spontaneous mass meetings, and all of these. In that sense, the resistive agenda that it took on, pretty much leaning to the left against the Panchayat regime, was quite effective, not only for its generation at that time, but also for the subsequent generations where similar such resistance needed to be, brought to forefront. So be it the 1990 movement or the 2006 uprising. In both these uprisings, quite spontaneously, the crowd leaned back to the old song sung by Ralpha, in that sense, kind of reminding people of the recent past.
This is really fascinating to bring it into connection with the 1990s and 2006. So can you tell us more about the importance of the legacy of the Ralpha movement? You've said the songs were recycled. Exactly how is this corpus of work then put into the present?
I won't say recycled in the sense that it wasn't a very formal movement. So even when we talk about when was it founded, how was it founded, there's a bit of anarchic element into it that Manjul and Ramesh, the two key members of this Ralpha group, initially set out to the Eastern Himalayas, basically just traveling and singing in impromptu kind of events put together by local people, despite their inclinations towards the left party. But I don't think the party had that much of a role in the way they kind of negotiated their own, artistic itineraries, so to say. Later, the band grew a little bigger with two or three other members. And then, officially speaking, it fell apart as a team or as a Ralpha group. And even today, there are speculations about what does Ralpha actually mean. It has been because they had chosen the word Ralpha to be free of any etymological kind of burden. So the Ralpha as a word doesn't really mean anything. But even then, there were so many speculations or interpretations added to that word. So that intrigue, it comes from a sense of artistic sensibility. And I would say that today, even after a few generations, there seems to be some kind of recognition of that artistic sensibility, right? That it had something new, something, that new, but also something that stood through the test of time, right? So they combine folk with guitar and played as if they are performing, Beatles in the countryside of Nepal. But in the meantime, they were singing songs about oppressed people, the right to express oneself freely, the right to, protest, the right to resist, all of these things. So quite a lot of these sentiments struck a chord. And I think the kind of artisticness, the aesthetics of being able to, pen the songs that were pretty poignant despite being having this folksy kind of, elements into it, and the melodies and kind of rhythms being quite modernist, despite leaning again to Jhaure. So these experimentations were pretty kind of this experimentation was received pretty well in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and at the new century. So in that sense, the importance of the legacy is probably self-evident, although it hasn't been very well archived or even narrativized. So there are different versions of what Ralpha is about, or what happened to Ralpha at a certain point of time from the beginning to its sort of end, and where is Ralpha after the end. So there are really different versions where the conundrum seems to be still waiting to be explained or waiting to play itself out.
And that's quite fascinating. And what you just shared shows some kind of relationship also between poetry and the political development of Nepal. And in a way, the movement could be seen as what we could call Nepal's heritage of civil uprise and dissent as well. So, how could we understand this, and how could one preserve, archive, and document this heritage of the Ralpha movement, really looking at it as a heritage that is not mainstream or monumental, but it's actually a oral tradition, but has a very significant importance in terms of political development in Nepal?
It is important to kind of preserve the heritage of civil movements and protest culture in Nepal. But in the meantime, protest culture or this alternative ways of expressions clearly, are arenas which are still kind of playing out the internal conundrum even now. So it's difficult to think about a very straightforward or straightjacket kind of narrative about what Ralpha is about. I think Nepal probably will have to wait a couple more years or maybe even a decade to have a kind of coherent narrative about its left movement going back to half a century, and within that how protest movements such as Ralpha, which is only one of them, there are several other protest movements that have played out extremely well and differently in various decades, right? So how are we to put all of these components together to come up with a broader theory and narrative on the protest culture and resistance movement in Nepal in terms of thinking about it in terms of heritage, right? It's kind of difficult to say. In terms of what has already been done, I see that there's a renewed interest on Ralpha, and a documentary film has been made very recently, interviewing the key kind of members of the Ralpha group. And increasingly, I see really comprehensive opinion pieces or commentary pieces written in Nepali in various media outlets, which serves the purpose pretty well for people within Nepal who are aware of these movements and aware of these platforms as archival platforms. Clearly, for people who are studying Nepal from outside, maybe they still need to kind of reorganize them, translate them, and bring it to the wider audience. I hope that will be done in the coming years. But also, I wanted to comment on, how it's not quite the past yet. Manjul, after his kind of spell of illness, he has returned to poetry, the public sphere, though with lesser active, itinerary than before. And Ramesh, another key member of Ralpha, is also quite active. And recently, I think maybe about a decade or 2 decades earlier, there was a documentary film called Itihas Jitneharuka Lagi, or The History of Those Who Win. Is a rough translation. I'm sure there's a better translation in official forms. But where Pranay Limbu, the director of the film, tried to contrast two singers from the Eastern Himalayas, Kuber Rai and Dheeraj Rai, the former leaning into the Indo-South Asian, kind of form of music, whereas Dheeraj Rai more of a kind of, pop music. And the documentary was supposed to kind of pay these two as a contradiction between modernity and tradition. And it was making its rounds when Ramesh kind of made a public statement, which he was doing pretty rarely at that time, to say that Nepal's culture is not quite what Kubir Rai was singing, which was more kind of Indo-South Asian kind of melody. What he said was, and it's kind of vulgar modernity, as people seem to kind of just justify, along with Dheeraj Rai's pop culture, the Western pop is not quite this kind of villain. What he actually said was pretty interesting, that when they were experimenting with the idea and aesthetics of Ralpha, the kind of Indo-South Asian hegemony on Nepal was what they sought to resist. They wanted to kind of make a statement that Nepali Chauri could be paired with something that is not necessarily South Asian, but global and global South, with a more kind of honest kind of engagement with the global resistance culture, and especially left. So although that documentary and that conversation with Ramesh was not quite about the archives of Ralpha, I think these periodic conversations are ongoing. Although they are tangential, they are actually quite clarificatory in understanding what Ralpha might have been, right? And what should be understood as the legacy of Ralpha going forward. So I think just as an anarchist movement, that it was when it started out, it remains kind of anarchist, and the legacy has to kind of grapple with a certain forms of contradictions as well.
Thank you for explaining the role of the public sphere within inclusive heritage. Can you tell us about your research methodology? How did you collaborate with Manjul?
My research methodology is as anarchist as I think the movement I was seeking to study as well. I mean, as somebody who was born and who grew up in Kathmandu, I think it's kind of bound to happen that our ethnographic fields are enmeshed in our lives, right? So it's difficult for me to think about, okay, I started my fieldwork on this date, I kind of collected these materials, I did this many interviews, and then I came up with this systematically. It's impossible to say. I've known Manjul pretty much all my life, but I have to say that before 1990, I knew of Manjul and several people like him around me as interesting people, who always said interesting things that is different from several other people. So not very common, but I think it was not possible for them to freely identify themselves as the movement of, groups like Ralpha or their party affiliations during the Punjab regime. So those were all hidden. So in school, we would sing Manjul's and Ralpha songs in a very selective sort of way. The ones that are least objectionable, the ones that could be used into choreography of children's songs that without being problematic or provocative. So that version of kind of changing the nation, looking for a new beginning, a new dawn, a change of direction. All of these themes were already inculcated in the way I was brought up without knowing the political legacies of these songs, which I came to know, in 1990, when suddenly everybody sort of, everybody's true colors came out, so as to say, right? And we were suddenly exposed with the completely different narratives, really different sets of texts and literature that we didn't have access to before, or kind of free kind of atmosphere where people could explain or have a discourse about the history and political legacies, and which for me was very formative as a young person in terms of understanding the new meanings of what I already knew, but what I didn't know what that was about, right? So these have kind of made impressions on me early on, but it's until, until very recently that I sought to write anthropological texts about poetry. That is a very recent endeavor. And that, I think, came from my wish to kind of understand this concept of nation better. And it comes from the first ethnographic fieldwork that I did among the workers and businessmen of the garment industry, on which I wrote my first book. And the book was on garment industry, but it's not quite, a book about how to make garment industry better. That's only part of the questions. The question was, why did an industry have such major fallout, and how was it possible to have such a major fallout, but without the public discourse in an era that we know as democratic, we know as liberated? And in all of this, the question being raised by people whose livelihoods were completely erased by the fall of the garment industry, essentially the subaltern workers with whom, I've spent a lot of time. I mean, this despair that they expressed didn't come in terms of the despair about the religion or the kind of the patrons of various kind, but they pretty much talked about, where is the nation when we need it most? Why isn't the country doing anything for us, right? And this is a question I have sort of thought a lot about while working in the garment industry in several other countries, which I had the opportunity to do when I was a World Bank staff. So what kind of stood out for me was the kind of absence of the nation state in Nepal in the context of this major the crisis about people's livelihood was unparalleled. The state really was absent for the people, the marginalized people, right? So that's when my interest to kind of comment and state kind of became paramount, and I began to read about nationalism and nation states. So that kind of, when I came back to my home region in 2012, 13, some of the readings that I began were Ashish Nandi, Sudipta Kaviraj, Dipesh Chakravarti, and others who have tried to theorize post-colonial nation states, right? And they have kind of really leaned on the poetics, especially Ashish Nandi and Sudipta Kaviraj, and later Shiva Viswanathan, in terms of trying to explain Tagore's kind of persistent reminder that the nation should not be aggressive, it should not be exclusionary, even when there's an anti-colonial struggle going on. The nation still should be inclusive and tolerant. So a lot of Tagore's writings in the form of fiction and poetry had those sentiments. And I think Sudipta Kaviraj and Ashish Nandi have done a really good job of explaining those kind of methodologies, which are not very straightforward and certainly not very systematic. Later, Shiva Viswanathan's work on the Slavic nations, when the war broke out there, again engages with the literature from there. So this is what influenced me, and I began to think about maybe turning my hobby, which I've always been kind of enthusiastic about, which is reading poetry and fiction, into writing about nationalism in Nepal, because I also felt that of all the theories that I was reading on kind of the nation state in Nepal, I think the poetic expressions are pretty strong. So I started with BP Koirala and Parijat. And BP's kind of writing in terms of fiction compared with his political writing and political prose in other forms, have a lot to offer in solving this conundrum. So that's how it started. And in terms of what exactly did I do, I mean, I've always read a lot of poems, including all of Manjul's poems, and I've had access to Manjul and his wife. So I've had several conversations with them. I've followed them in several of their performances here, there, and other. There have been free-flowing conversations, and based on which I said, I'm going to just write a piece, and here we are.
That must have been really, inspiring to work with Manjul as well. How was your experience of working with Manjul or reading Manjul's work? You are a poet yourself, and you have been translating poetry. How has his work inspired yours, and how has translating poetry also influenced your writing of poetry?
Poetry writing for me is not quite a professional engagement. It's I think I treat it as a therapy largely, and I've not tried to publish my work too much. I mean, I may give one or two of my poems here there for recitation and for publishing when I have requests. But other than that, but I do write, but I don't really do anything with it. And I don't really think of myself as a poet per se, although I do enjoy reading other people's poems. And in terms of translation, it's interesting because what I've come to understand about myself is that I am incapable of writing poetry in English, which is my professional language for all these decades, but also in Newa, which is my mother tongue. So if I have to write something in English or Newa, I mean, it's not a process that I enjoy. Nepali, for better or for worse, was the language imposed by, on everybody during the Panchayat regime. And that's the language where I feel I express myself freely, in the sense that, I gather this sense of having said something. I've finally, made my point by writing a poem to myself. Whereas I don't need to translate Manjul's poetry into Nepali. In this article, I've actually translated his poems from Nepali to English, which for me is not something I would do for my, leisure, for example. It's purely academic pursuit. And in terms of translating, of course, translating is deep reading, and especially trying to write his poetry anthropologically has, given me opportunities to read his poems against many other contexts, such as the Ralpha context that I bring in this paper, or his kind of life story. So that's different from just reading poems for reading's sake, or reading poems as poems, right? So there is a certain degree of analysis that has gone into it, and I think that has kind of deepened my reading of poems. And in terms of Manjul's poetry, what I really have appreciated about Manjul, as a very quiet kind of observer of his life over a really long period of time, is his adaptability, and how honest and candid he's been about several kind of, changes in his positionality, which were negotiated not so much in a self-righteous or, in terms of self-interest. People do that, but I think in case of Manju, these phases of life, which are really different from one another, like the Ralpha phase, the Siddhisaran phase, and phase when he became quite ill, and now he's recovering. In between, there was a phase when he engaged with anthropologists, working on interpreting development, if I may say so. So all these phases have been quite different from one another, and his writings do differ. And at the very late phase, I find his poems kind of reflect on, his exposure in various different worlds, which capture a certain degree of kind of Nepali cultural, political, economic history, right? And he has this ability to write this very poignantly. And also, he's a prolific writer, so he doesn't edit himself much, which means that, one can see the changing thoughts in him without being filtered too much. And that's a joy for an ethnographer who wants to write about a poet anthropologically. But in the meantime, lately, I mean, these two anthologies that I've read are serious work. The one on Siddhicharan, on which I've written a paper, but also another on Mrityu, or the death, where he has penned 108 poems. Clearly, that's not Futkar Kavita or Sospurta Kavita, right? That's a very meditated kind of project he's taken on, where he's reflecting really a lot on his life and the times that he and his contemporaries have gone through. So those give really interesting kind of foods for thought for somebody who is trying to work out what aging is and how can one understand the different phases the nation has gone through, and what this means for common people. How are common people making sense of those various phases that the nation has gone through?
Thank you. That's fascinating. So we have learned now a lot about, the audience and the sizing and how personal poetry can be, and how big an audience can be. So if we think in that line, how significant is Manjul's work in terms of the wider literary scene in Nepali?
I think the Nepali literary scene is pretty wide for the size of country that it is. I think, in Africa, you'd see everybody sings and everybody dances. And in Nepal, I feel everybody's a poet and everybody writes, right? So there's a really kind of wide sphere within poetry. And there are kind of major generational shifts, right? From people who have thought to write in Chanda to people who wanted to bring a kind of disruption to that world of order, and then various kind of movements changing Nepali language towards more vernacular, and then there are several kind of cross-border conversations that have gone on between the poets who are writing in Nepali language on the other side of the border in Eastern Himalayas, and people who are in Kathmandu, east or west, right? And people like interlocutors like Parizad and many others who came from the other side of the border and kind of made Nepal their home, brought in a great deal of alternative cosmopolitan sensibilities into the Nepali literary scene. Within that, I mean, the few aspects of Nepali literature that I have kind of looked into in my earlier paper, kind of commenting on B.P. Koirala and Parizat, clearly there's this kind of liberal writing and left writing. But in the meantime, especially taking more interest in the left literary scene. I mean, if we just look at various interpretations of Parizat's writing, there are aspects when she says, okay, I am a nihilist writer, but I have given up on that ideology to embrace communism, to be a proper communist and activist. So I now write for the people, right? And that particular, so people who theorize or kind of bring periodical order into her life have, for quite some time written about, Parijat's poetic death, that her first two novels, Shirisko Phul and Mahattahin, which are much more readily available in the market for lay readers, and are probably the two novels before she embraced left ideology so publicly, what are considered two great work of hers. And everything else that she wrote after is relatively not known and kind of sometimes dismissed by literary critics as written the literary work that marks kind of shallowing of her poetic talent. And very recently, there's a kind of reinterpretation to that to seek for a more holistic notion of what left consciousness has been in Nepali literary scene before and after Parijat. And of course, now I see slam poetry making an entry in Nepal, and really young generation of poets kind of bringing in really a new rigor and energy into kind of the performative aspect of poetry from various parts of the world, right? So these kind of global, local intersections that touch Nepali literary, I think is quite rich and pluralistic. This is the lens through which I've chosen to, understand Nepali literature, which I'm aware is very much a perspective of somebody who doesn't actually join the literary kind of engagements within Kathmandu. So I don't actually have a poetic circle. I don't visit very contemporary, poetry recital sessions, etc., etc. It's somebody who's looking at Nepali literature from distance. And maybe this distance is added in terms of the work that I did on this during the pandemic times when the isolation is kind of added to it, right? But even after the pandemic, I think I live in Delhi, not in Kathmandu, and I'm an anthropologist, not a poet in real terms. So I think it's this kind of arm's length sort of distance with which I develop my own interpretation of where Nepali literature is heading to.
You've been studying poetry, as you just mentioned, as a way to understand these broader issues of national politics and dissent, and as well as locating it within the anthropological debates. How does Manju's work fit into this and into the anthropological debates on epistemologies of writing culture and as well as cultural studies?
Yeah, so when the writing culture book came out and became the essential reading, part of the canon for anthropology, it brought in a great deal of hope, right, about the possibility of, righting the wrongs of, where anthropology was during the colonial times, or giving us the epistemology to actually challenge the power. And what I find really interesting is the volume that came soon after the writing culture book, which is the women writing culture book, which Ruth Behed and Deborah Gordon kind of wrote as a derivative dialogue with the writing culture book. And they said, the writing culture book actually does generate a lot of hope, except that it came out of a kind of closed door seminar where a lot of people didn't quite have the invitation. So then it didn't have any women in it. So it's not that, Behed and Gordon were talking about why were there no women. I mean, I don't think that was the question, but the question was, what would it look like if people who are not always kind of considered the founding fathers or the fathers or the giants of anthropology, if they were invited hypothetically to that conference, how would the writing culture book look like, right? So they started largely with a kind of artistic piece about kind of bare-breasted women, right? In anthropology, women who bare their breasts are always the other. Whereas in art, maybe it could be an anthropologist women. So a white woman holding a pen in her hand and trying to write, but in the meantime, a savage in terms of baring her breast, they said is a kind of enigma, and we have to, this image kind of, raises a lot of questions. And this is where they began to say, so anthropologists must engage not only with other anthropologists, but people who are not anthropologists, but who have the ability to provoke questions, especially when anthropologists have now charted out this mission to, speak speak to the power, right? So Behr and Gordon's Women Writing Culture book actually engages with a book that had come out a little earlier and has gone on to become this alternative canon among the literary scholars, which is called This Bridge Called My Back by Chedi Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa, where they really brought in people of various colors, class, caste, sexuality, to pen freely what the writer's usage is, right? And leaning on this collaboration, Deborah Gordon and Ruth Behr kind of initiated this new epistemology of reading anthropologists who are also fiction writers, or fiction writers or poets who might never have been anthropologists, but who have a lot to contribute in terms of the counterculture that the new anthropology was seeking to become in the 1990s and then forward, right? So I mean, that's kind of in the US. It also became the new movement among what they called the women with color, or the Black anthropologists kind of movement. And Faye Harrison, who wrote this book, I think in 1989, called Decolonizing Anthropology. So the whole notion of decolonizing, being kind of written a while before it became mainstream or fashionable within anthropology, kind of, also tried to explain how ethnographies, which are these pretty strange writings that anthropologists do, which is supposed to be a little bit of fiction, travelogue, but also a scientific report. And then how do we treat our interlocutors in ethnographic writing? Are we able to differentiate our ethnographic interlocutors if they are common people versus if they are theorists versus if they are, a pioneering leader, a visionary? I mean, how do we write them in, right? So she's engaged with anthropologist Dora Neale Hurston and her kind of fictive accounts to kind of make this case that anthropologists have quite a lot to, learn or enrich especially kind of bring in more diversity within anthropology if we engage with interlocutors in their true strength, as opposed to insisting on ethnographizing everything. So these kind of conversations have really informed me in not reading of Manju's poetry, which I've been doing really for a long time, but in kind of the way I found some kind of order or structure in writing about his poems anthropologically. So in some ways, this is really a conversation with Africa, with Africa, America, in kind of bringing plurality within anthropology.
Thank you very much. This is a beautiful answer, and it leads kind of, or it links your life, your biography very well to sort of the changes within the subject. Now, you lived in South Africa for quite some time, where the decolonization debate was already in full swing when you were there. In what way would you situate Manjul's approach within the realm of decolonization, perhaps as a starting point to end epistemological imperialism in Nepal?
I do work on Nepal, that's kind of evident. But I don't, see myself as somebody who is kind of defining the Nepal studies. I think Nepal studies is really broad field, and there should be, there already is a great deal of eclecticism in this, and there should be more plurality. That is kind of my view. But you're right that when I was in South Africa, I found it really liberating to have all these the kind of discourses going on. Going back to people like Magubani, who would say, we don't need anthropology as such. Anthropology has served its purpose and now should be, waved farewell. This is quite an extremist kind of position, right? And not very different from the way people like Paul Nkui has documented in an important book on plurality within anthropology, edited by Gustavo Ribeiro and Arturo Escobar, called World Anthropologies, where he documents how in the 1960s and 70s, several African countries actually shut down the departments of anthropology and converted them into Department of Development Studies. And this is, of course, before developmentalism was taken over by West through the foreign aid, which then basically, brings people to the same question of how do we contest the Western hegemony, right? And then there are other discussions about people like Artem Afiji to kind of, is he an informant? Is he an interlocutor? Or is he an anthropologist, as a Black anthropologist who couldn't be employed as an anthropologist during the apartheid years? How do we kind of, rewrite their perspectives and their work, right? And which is a discussion kind of reminds me of Dur Bahadur Bister and the two really nice documentary films that have been made, but also several kind of anthropological discourses within Nepal that have tried to find a way out of this notion of is native an anthropologist or an informer, or and how are the native anthropologists to situate themselves, right? How does conventional anthropology see the natives? And clearly we've come a long way from there, but more recently, widening the ambit of anthropology. In a more recent book that Faye Harrison wrote about Outsider Within, where she kind of, emphasized the importance to make anthropology eccentric, way people who have been marginalized in the history of anthropology to be reread, revitalized. How can we rehistoricize anthropology and anthropological canons, right? How, and in that context, were some of the fiction writers also anthropologists, or people who wrote both anthropology and fiction, but people who clearly felt they expressed themselves much more spontaneously and freely and easily in the genres outside ethnographic writing. How are we to read these and engage with them earnestly, as opposed to just dismissing them as, okay, this, that, and the other are not anthropology, so let's just kind of move on. So these discussions, I think, are quite important. And so with these lens, I turn to the kind of literary scene in Nepal. Manju, one of them. I mean, I hope that my paper or my discourse doesn't kind of give the wrong impression that, I'm trying to establish Manjula as the most important writer in Nepal. I mean, there are several important writers. But I think in terms of my approach, the corpus or the field where I have access to, maybe there's a kind of public duty for anthropologists to kind of convey this to broad audience. So clearly, I mean, I started with Rala, Parisat, Manjul, and there are many more who need to be studied and whose perspectives may enrich discussions about nation or self or modernity or protest culture or the Nepali cultural political history. I think there are a lot of really interesting perspectives in there, and I think it benefits anthropology to be less selective and broaden its outreach in terms of what it considers anthropologically useful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mallika ji. It was really an inspiring conversation to think about political movements and poetry and how it inspires each other and how this also helps us to think about decolonizing anthropological and academic debates. Thank you so much for talking to us in this podcast series. Thank you.
Commissioned music for this podcast has been produced by Vayu Audio Studios. Composer, music arrangement, guitar, tuna, sound mix and master, Vayu. Madal Dime Damaha and percussion, Kunal Singh. Bamboo flute, Anish Maharjan. Recorder, Jaco. Bass guitar, BK. Cello, Celso.